Walk through almost any old cemetery and you'll notice something strange. Some graves are covered in fresh flowers. Others, just a few rows over, are sinking quietly into the grass, unread, untouched. Sometimes for decades you assume a grave is permanent, a name carved in stone, meant to last. But the real answer is far stranger than permanent, because most graves are not actually kept alive by stone at all. They're kept alive by memory. And memory has an expiration date most people never think about. Let's start with what a grave actually needs to survive. In every sense of that word, physically, a grave needs almost nothing. Stone lasts. Given basic maintenance, a headstone can remain legible for well over a century. But there's a second kind of survival a grave depends on, one far more fragile than granite. And that's the survival of being remembered by someone still living. Sociologists, who study memorial behavior, often describe this using the idea of two deaths. The first death is biological, the moment a person's body stops functioning. The second death happens much later, when the last living person who actually knew that individual, who could picture their face, remember their voice, recall a specific afternoon spent with them, also dies. After that second death, the person doesn't disappear from records, but they disappear from anyone's direct memory. They become, essentially, a name only. And here's the part almost nobody considers. That second death, statistically, tends to arrive faster than you'd expect. Genealogists and memory researchers have long observed a rough pattern in family memory. Grandparents are usually remembered vividly by grandchildren who knew them personally. Great-grandparents are remembered more faintly, often as a name attached to a story rather than a living presence. By the time you reach great-great-grandparents, most families retain almost nothing personal at all, just a name on a document, if that. On average, active personal memory of an individual tends to fade within 2 to 3 generations, somewhere around 60 to 100 years after death, even in families that care deeply about their history, which means, statistically, most graves become functionally unvisited within a single century. Not because anyone stopped caring, but because the people capable of caring eventually stop existing too. So what actually happens to a grave once that memory fades? The answer depends heavily on where in the world it's located, and on something most people never think about: who is legally responsible for maintaining it. In many cemeteries, especially older ones, burial plots were sold with an assumption of permanent care, but no actual binding requirement for descendants to maintain them. Cemetery associations and municipalities are often left responsible for basic upkeep, mowing, path maintenance, general grounds care, but not for individual headstones, which legally belong to the family, forever, whether that family shows up or not. Over decades, headstones lean, inscriptions erode, some sink into softening ground and vanish beneath the surface entirely. Small cemeteries with no dedicated maintenance fund can slide into what preservationists call a state of landscape abandonment, where nature slowly reclaims the site. Grass grows tall, tree roots crack through old foundations, and stones topple with nobody left to set them upright again. On more extreme cases, particularly in crowded cities with limited burial space, some countries take an even more direct approach. In parts of Germany, for example, standard burial plots are leased, not purchased outright, typically for 20 to 30 years. If no family member renews the lease and no one steps forward to pay for continued care, the grave can legally be reused, the remains respectfully relocated or consolidated, and a new burial placed in that same plot. That idea tends to unsettle people the first time they hear it. It runs against an assumption many cultures share instinctively, that a grave, once dug, belongs to that person forever. But some societies have quietly built their entire burial systems around a different, more practical truth: that space, unlike memory, is finite, and eventually has to be renewed for the living. Even in places where graves are never legally reclaimed, there's a slower, gentler kind of fading that happens anyway. Historians and preservation groups researching old cemeteries frequently find graves where the inscription has worn completely smooth, the name gone entirely, the person reduced to an anonymous stone marker among rows of others equally blank. Some preservation societies now spend years working purely to recover these lost names, cross-referencing burial ledgers, church records, and old newspapers just to reattach an identity to a stone that outlived every person who ever knew whose stone it was. So here's where that leaves you, standing in that cemetery, looking at the difference between the flower-covered grave and the sinking, silent one nearby. The unvisited grave was not abandoned because anyone failed that person. It's simply further along a timeline every grave eventually reaches. Once every person capable of remembering them has, in turn, become a name on stone themselves. That's not really a story about neglect. It's a story about how memory works, quietly passed from person to person like something fragile being handed down a long line of hands, until eventually, inevitably, there's no hand left to receive it. Your own grave, someday, will follow the same arc. Visited at first, then visited less, then, eventually, visited by no one at all. Not because you were forgotten out of carelessness, but because forgetting, on a long enough timeline, is simply what happens to every name that time touches. The flowers on that other grave aren't really about permanence. They're a reminder